Good morning. My wife turned to me as I was getting ready to go up, and she goes, "This is a good sermon." And I said, "Not yet." Because there's three sermons. The thing is with sermons, I'm halfway done. You don't realize that I'm halfway done, and you're just starting your sermon. I'm halfway done. I've done the preparation. There's a sermon. There's slides. I've done what I like to think of as the iceberg work. There's all sorts of stuff under the waterline that hopefully you don't even know about, but that I studied to prepare for it. And that, I'm good with this sermon. I'm really good with this sermon. In fact, I'm really excited about this sermon. This is the last sermon as we've talk about the idea of loving the Lord your God with all your heart. But that's just a sermon I prepare, and there's three sermons. There's the sermon I prepare, there's the sermon I give, and then there's the one you hear. And those three are not always the same. So I'm halfway done, but you're just getting started. And so as we start this morning, we're going to be looking at the very end of the Old Testament. The very last two verses in the Old Testament, in Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, is a prophecy of the Elijah that was to come. Now, the New Testament clarifies for us that Elijah is John the Baptist. That John the Baptist was a man of the character and the behavior and the heart of Elijah. That they are of the same kind. Do you ever meet somebody and you're like somebody else I know? That's what John the Baptist was. And so in Malachi chapter 4, is God, as He's about to enter a 400-year period of silence. Between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament is 400 years. That's like 1 3/4 Americas. These are the last two things that He's going to say. "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord come." The day of the Lord that He's speaking of there is the coming of the church, the kingdom, the king. So before Him will come this Elijah, who's John the Baptist. And what will He do? He will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction. Now, in Luke will reiterate this prophecy and will mention that, yes, this is John the Baptist, and he will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God. This is actually the angel telling Zechariah, this is what your kid will be. He will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God, and He will go before Him in Him, being Jesus, in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready for the Lord a people prepared. John the Baptist was a unique person, unique in his time. He was the bulldozer, sometimes we refer to him, because he was making a path for Jesus. He's not the guy. He's the guy who announces the guy. He's not the one that ultimately everybody is to follow. He's the one who tells everybody and heralds who is the one that they ought to follow. And in the Old Testament, as God finishes up His account to the people of Israel, He said, what's His job going to be? His job is going to be to get the hearts of the fathers to look towards their children, and the hearts of the children to look towards their fathers. What ultimately He is saying is that John the Baptist is going to do something that we see over and over and over again failing in the Jewish world. A generation arises that knows not God. Over and over again, whether you are looking during the time of the judges or you look during the era of the kings, you will have this break that happens where one generation does not do their job of preparing the hearts of the next generation. And on top of it, the next generation does not have a heart for the older generation to learn from them. And so you have older people looking at younger people like they're a waste of their time and you don't know anything. And you have younger people looking at older people and going, you don't know anything. The world's changed. We never face that now. It's the irony of all times and all people is that the biggest issue that we have is that by the time one generation learns what really matters, they've not passed it on to their kids. And their kids have not learned to respect them. And so there becomes this break. And what was John the Baptist's job? Get the fathers and the children back to thinking about what matters. Turn the hearts of the fathers back to the children so they're thinking about that generation that's coming and preparing them to serve the Lord. And the hearts of the children to look back to the fathers and learn the lessons from the fathers so that they would not be disobedient, but instead would be wise, would be just. There's 5 different lessons that I want you to learn from these 2 passages, and I'll keep both of them up here on the side all along. But there are 5 specific things that I think we can learn about having hearts for our children. This is a parenting lesson, not pulled from a typical parenting verse. We'll grab some of the typical parenting verses. In fact, if you are somebody who kind of wants to be ready in your Bible, get ready for Proverbs. We're going to grab lots and lots of Proverbs today. But the reality is that the reason that John the Baptist was sent was to get multiple generations back to thinking about God. And so God, instead of saying, hey, I just want you to get people thinking about Jesus, and I want them to be ready for the kingdom, he compares it to a family. And that's the first thing I want you to understand, is that the kingdom begins with the family. It's always been that way. Whether you're talking about the kingdom of Israel or you're talking about the kingdom of Christ, it is all about the family. The backbone of the church will always be the family. So much so that even once somebody comes into the church and they say, well, I don't have anybody I'm related to. That was me, by the way. I became a Christian, and I didn't come from some family where there have been multiple generations that had served the Lord. I just came from no man's land. And so what are we told to do with those who come from no man's land? Oh yeah, enfold them and treat them like family. We're a family that's built through adoption, but we're still a family. Jeremiah chapter 32, verses 38 through 40, a passage that points both to the people who would return from Babylon and to the church that would come later. God describes and says, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God. And I will give them one heart and one way, that they may fear me forever, for their own good and the good of their children after them. And I will put the fear of me in their hearts, that they may not turn from me. Throughout the Bible, the pattern is that once you have found God, you are to follow Him and have a heart for Him and be His people. And then what are you to do with the next generation? Teach them to do the same. Break the generational divide and division that Satan started. And you can see that. Satan has always been trying to do that, to break that pattern of God using families. You start in Eden. You go all the way back to the very beginning. And how does God begin Eden with? Oh, He begins it with the family. And then where does Satan try and break it apart? He tries to divide the family. He does it with Eve and with Adam. And He later does it again with Cain, with Abel. Or if you're talking about how God saved the world. God saved the world from all the wickedness that was in it. It had gotten so wicked that the thoughts and intentions of the sons of men were always violent and wicked continually. And so God says, I've got to save this creation that I've made. How does He save it? He saves it through family. Noah and his family. And when you talk about the nation of Israel, well, the nation of Israel, why do we even call it the nation of Israel? Oh, right, that's the guy's name. Israel is named after a man named Jacob. And then there's 12 tribes in it, and those 12 tribes are named after his sons. And oh, by the way, where did Jacob come from? Oh, right, he came from Isaac, and Isaac came from Abraham, and it's all about a family. This has been a pattern that God has used because God created the family. And he created parents within that family in order to guide the children, guide that next generation, not to guide them just willy-nilly, but and guide them towards him. And then even when Jesus is sent, when God sends his very own son, listen to the language, he sends his very own son. That's family language, isn't it? He sends him and places him within a family. Mary, Joseph, brothers, with sisters. And then you turn to the New Testament. And we often talk about the Eastland Church, the Church of Christ. It belongs to Christ. Or we can call ourselves the Church of God. We belong to God. But we can also call ourselves the body of Christ. We could also say that we are the kingdom, because Jesus is our king. But a very common title within the Bible is also the family of God, or the household of God. Throughout the Bible, there is this common thread. And that thread is one of family. And God takes, and he will talk about grafting people into his family. That's what he did with the Gentiles. The Jews, they said, well, the Gentiles can't be allowed in. They're outside the family. We're of the lineage of Abraham. They're not. You don't let the Gentiles in. And what does God say? He says, oh no, I can graft in whomever I want. But grafting in still makes you now a part of the family. And we're told that we can cry, Abba, Father, because we are adopted sons and daughters. The pattern of family is so strong throughout the Bible that you can't hardly look anywhere in it without seeing its importance. Which is why it's important for us to understand that if we are going to do God's work in our families, if you are a parent, it's going to begin with you having a heart for your children. Because first and foremost, they have been given to you as a stewardship. You did not make their soul. God is the Father of spirits. God gave them to you for a time to raise according to his will. But also, because the reality is that God intends for us to use that time with our children to bring them to him. In Proverbs 3, verse 11 and 12, my son, do not despise the Lord's discipline, or be weary of his reproof, for the Lord reproves him whom he loves, as a father the son in whom he delights. If you're a parent, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think about it before you answer yes. Because the by rote answer to this is, oh, of course, yes. But I want you to think, I want you to pause in your mind for just half a second and actually ask yourself the question, do you delight in your children? Because I know you're supposed to say yes. I know you're supposed to say yes. But when it's 3 a.m., and that baby's still crying, or you've told that kid no 17 times in the last 15 minutes, or when they look at you with rebellion in their eyes and treat you like you are dirt, do you delight in your children? That word delight means to set your affection. And it's a heart idea, to set your affection. The most common translation for that word delight is actually the word accept. That's the most, if you go through the Bible, and every time that word shows up, the Hebrew word for delight, the most common translation for it is accept. As a father of the son in whom he accepts. So I ask you, do you accept your kid? Now, that doesn't mean you accept all of their behavior, right? We started off by talking about the discipline of the Lord. But I mean, Have you decided that that is my kid and it will always be my kid and I will always take responsibility for my role in their life? Have you set your affection on them? Because that's what it means for the hearts of the fathers to turn to the children. Because if every generation of Israel had taken seriously that it was their job to care about their kids and raise them in the fear and admonition of the Lord, the Old Testament would look a lot different, wouldn't it? And yes, there's free will and everybody makes their own choice. But the pattern is that when parents have a heart for their children, their kids turn out a lot better. So do you delight in your kids? Or do you spend most of your time complaining about them and grumbling about them, which, by the way, they hear? You think they don't hear. They hear. Have you set your affection on them? Proverbs 13, verse 24, whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. You know, this was a verse that gets avoided a lot because, CPS. Right? The social worker came to your house, Proverbs 13:24 probably would not be the first verse that you'd want to show them. And so we avoid it. But look, are we Bible people? Are we going to add or subtract from the word, or is it in there? He who spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. You notice the language here. It's not hatred that leads to discipline, it's love. And if there is not any love, there is no discipline. Proverbs 19:18, discipline your son, for there is hope. Do not set your heart on putting him to death. When we cease to discipline our children, we've given up on them. If the hearts of the fathers are supposed to belong to the children, and I've been talking about fathers a lot, this also applies to mothers. Mothers should have hearts for their children, but I'll tell you what, it starts with dad. And I will die on that hill. Dad. If dad has a heart for his kids, mom will follow suit. But if you cease to discipline your kids, you've given up on them. Discipline your son, for there is hope. Hope of what? There's hope that they'll get better. There's hope that they'll grow. There's hope that they'll learn. God has designed discipline to be something, as Proverbs 13, the verse above says, it should be done diligently. If discipline is not done diligently, that's where it gets the bad rap. That's where it gets the CPS language. When discipline is just done out of frustration or anger, when you've just had enough and so you snapped, that's not discipline anymore. Discipline is the process of training your children to be who they ought to be, and that is done diligently. It's done every day. It's done with consistency. It's done according to a pattern, because you have hope that they will grow up and be better people than you. That's what it means to have a heart for your children, is that you want them to surpass you. And I would argue they're going to need to. It's interesting to me how oftentimes out of the same mouth we talk about how bad things are getting in the world, and then we want to make it easier for our kids. Do you see how those two things don't work together? The world is getting harder for our kids to live in, but we want to make it easier for kids, even though they're going to live in a world in which they're going to have to do heavier lifting than you. Now, I want my kids to have a better foundation. If that's what we mean by easier, I want them to know more about God and be stronger in Him and have a greater commitment to Him earlier than I did. I don't want them to go through the school of knucklehead that Dad has gone through. Absolutely. If that's what we mean, then absolutely. But so often what we mean is we want our kids to have an easier life here. And so we make it easier instead of providing them with diligent discipline so that they will be better. Because if you knew that your kid was going to have to go swim 2 miles in open water, if you knew eventually they were going to be dropped off and have to swim 2 miles in open water, and if they weren't strong enough, they would drown, what would you be doing with your kid every day? The answer is swim, right? You would be swimming with your kid. What do you think you're doing? When they grow up, they will leave your house and they will swim in open water. And by the way, there are sharks. You've got to prepare them for that. That's your job. Have a heart for your children. The world has completely messed it up. To have a heart for your children is not buy them more stuff and give them what they want all the time and make their life always easier. It is none of those things. In fact, Satan laughs when we take the time that God has given us with our kids and use it for that, because he's like, great, make them soft. They're chewy then. We're not meant to be doing that. Love them, yes. Have hopes and dreams for them, yes. That they would be able to swim in open water and know who they have to cling to in those times. I want your kids to love the Lord more than you do. The third thing is, the hearts of the fathers, turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers. If you want to understand what ultimately your goal is as a parent is, it's to get to your kid's heart. Now, if you don't understand that, yeah, things like discipline absolutely get out of whack. Right? Because if discipline is purely behavior modification, this is where we see, and we all know examples of this, where there was a household that was harsh and rigid, and we did behavior modification, and then the kid left the house, and what happened? Off to live however they pleased. Well, why'd that happen? Because the parents got to the behavior, but they didn't get to the heart. The hearts of the fathers are to care about the children, and we want to get to the children's hearts. Proverbs 23, 25 through 26. Let your father and mother be glad. Let her who bore you rejoice. My son, give me your heart. And let your eyes observe my ways. And have you noticed there, give me your heart and let your eyes observe my ways. Combine that with Proverbs 3:1. My son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. So you're asking your kid to give you their heart, and their eyes are supposed to watch what you do, observe your ways, and they're supposed to listen to what you teach. What happens if what you teach and what you do aren't the same? You want to lose your kids' heart? How you do it? Let them observe your ways, which they will do, and let them hear your teachings and realize they are worlds apart. One of the most painful realities for me as a preacher, I'll just put the preacher hat on for a second. I haven't actually been wearing it. I'll go wear it right now. A hard thing as a preacher is everything I say is on record. And I get this big old monologue, right, of 35 minutes or so. And it's not just that you hear it, and then you go your way, and you can just assume that I live up to the things that I'm saying. And I could probably pull that off with at least some of you. But there's some of the people who are listening right now to all the things that I'm saying in my monologue, and they hear it every single Sunday, and then they get in the van with me and they go home. And so they get to observe my ways and remember my teaching. And you want to know why so many preachers' kids fall away? I'm going to give you a hint. It's that. Because they had an entire period of their life. Not always. This is not 100%. I'm not denouncing every single preacher. But I want you to understand there's a reason there's a stereotype of the preacher's kid. because they got to hear Dad's teaching, and then they observe his way, and if those things don't match, guess who knows? You might not know, but they would. Who you are and what you say have got to be the same. And that means when you blow it, you've got to own that too. When you sin, you've got to tell your kids, I sinned. I sinned. It's the wrong move. I'm sorry. Because they're going to observe your ways, and they're going to hear your teaching, and you're asking them to give you their heart. Proverbs 22, verse 15, folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline drives it far from him. Folly is an interesting word. In Proverbs, it's almost always referring to sinful behavior, but the word itself does not necessarily require sinful behavior. But when you have a foolish person who's a grown-up, it absolutely, over and over again, folly in a grown-up is going to be sinful. But the word folly, I actually like one of the definitions that Thayer uses with it is the idea of silliness. Silliness. And when you think about kids, do kids, do they have silliness bound up in their heart? Yeah, absolutely. Right now, Art can walk like 4 steps. But that's all he wants to do. Because it takes too long to walk, I'd rather crawl. You know, that's really silly. It's really silly that he would crawl everywhere when he has the ability to walk. That's really silly. But to him, that's the way. It's so much easier. Now, if Steve started doing that, we wouldn't just say silly anymore. We'd say there's something wrong with that man, right? We'd move to falling in the more clear sense, right? Because there's a certain point where you should kind of grow out of that stuff, right? You see lots of behavior in your kids. It's just because they're kids. And it's okay that it's there. It's just silly right now. But I'll tell you what, it's not silly when they're grown up. It's silly when they throw the temper tantrum at 6 months old. Art, right now, food is life, and I get this kid. But he has this thing where he'll chuck his head back every time he's mad, and mostly it's mad because we're not giving him food fast enough. And he'll go, ah, and he just throws his head back, and he'll throw his head back, and he'll hit it on the back of a chair, or he'll hit it on the ground, or he'll get mad at me, and so he'll lay down on the floor and beat his head on the ground. Beat his head. If you ever see like a mark on his head, it's because he got mad probably at me. And probably because I didn't hand him a toy fast enough, or I wasn't feeding him quickly enough. But he just throws temper tantrums, and frankly, it's pretty funny. And maybe it makes me a bad person, but when my kid beats his head on the floor, I laugh. I just flat out laugh. It's funny because he's mad at me, but he's hurting himself. It's like, dude. But it wouldn't be funny. 30, 40 years from now, he's doing things because he's mad at somebody else or some circumstance, and he's hurting himself. And you realize that that's exactly what many, many, many adults do. They get upset at something that happens in their life. They get upset at what's going on in their life, and they don't know how to properly deal with it. And so instead of dealing with it the way God intends, we hurt ourselves, we hurt our soul. Your job is to get the silliness out. Enjoy the process, because it's lots of fun. But your job is to get the silliness out, because you love them. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. You notice, if you're going to discipline your children, you need to be disciplined too. You are the most powerful person in the room as the parent. You're big, they're small. Until they get older, and then all of a sudden some of them get taller than you. But in the beginning, you are the most powerful person in the room. You know what's really easy? To use that power to provoke them to anger, to abuse it, But if you want them to grow up with discipline and instruction, you must have discipline and instruction in your own life. You must model what you want them to have. The problem is not discipline. The problem is undisciplined people parenting. When you are an undisciplined person and you are trying to raise a small person, you are not going to model for them what they need. You need to bear the fruit of the Spirit of self-control. You need to model discipline so that you offer discipline. The fourth thing is disobedience. If you look at Malachi, when it's quoted in Luke 1, there's a twist. And sometimes in the New Testament this will happen where the New Testament becomes a commentary on the Old Testament. It's a beautiful thing when it happens. I always get excited whenever I come across an Old Testament passage in the New Testament and God has tweaked it a little bit in order to give us a commentary. In the Old Testament, Malachi, it says that the hearts of the children would return to their fathers. But in the New Testament, when Luke writes it, it's the disobedient would return and would turn to the wisdom of the just. The way that we conquer disobedience is by teaching them to honor wisdom and justice. Wisdom is the ability to see the end of a thing at its beginning, and that people who have been around the block a little bit will be helpful to you. Justice is what is fair and true. Colossians 3, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Why is it okay for you to tell your children to obey you? Colossians 3 tells you. Because it pleases God. That's an act of faith, by the way. Because sometimes you feel like, I don't know, am I really supposed to be in charge of a person? I have plants that I kill. When you tell your children to obey you, that's pleasing in the Lord for them to learn to obey those who are older and wiser. Let's forget about modesty for a second. I know a lot of you are very modest people and humble, and you understand there's lots you don't know and things like that, but can we agree that you know more than a 5-year-old? If you do not know more than a 5-year-old, come and talk to me afterwards, and we'll deal with that. But can we agree that the adults in the room know more about how to live than a 5-year-old? It's okay for you to tell a 5-year-old, no, you need to obey me. That's pleasing to the Lord. Children, obey your parents, Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, and it goes on to say that it would be well with you. You have wisdom, and they need it. And if you can't teach them to honor those who are older and wiser and have more experience than them now, when they reach adulthood and you say, well, you should obey God because he's older and wiser and has more experience than you, they're going to listen because they didn't see it in the first place. And the fifth thing, the last thing is, remember what John the Baptist's job was to do? Make ready a people prepared for the Lord. John's not the guy. He's the guy who got them ready for the guy. That's your real job in parenting. Malachi 2:15, same book. Malachi 2:15, what was the one God seeking? What was the one God seeking? Godly offspring. That's what God wants, godly offspring. Matthew 19:13 through 14. The children were brought to him that he may lay his hands on them and pray, and the disciples rebuked the people, but Jesus said, let the little children come to me and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven. That is not metaphorical. Those are literal children who are literally trying to get to Jesus. And Jesus says, don't hinder them. This is the future of the church. Yes, there's a sense in which all of us should be like little children. All of us should have humility towards God. All of us should be before our Father like kids. But in this verse right here, it's literal. No, let the kids come to me. Because this is what the kingdom belongs to. We often talk about the difficulties of evangelism in this world. There's two pathways to evangelism. We either get to adults who have gone through an awful lot of stuff and bring them and enfold them and graft them into the family of God. Or we get to people before they've had all of that. And we reach them while they're young. Look, you know as well as I do, which is easier to do, which is more effective, preventative health maintenance or a big surgery later. Parenting is preventative maintenance. It is your opportunity to help your kids avoid so many of the pains that come from a life without God. You can get to them early. It's the most effective long-term evangelism program we have. So have a heart for your children. And to do so is to love the Lord your God with your whole heart. This time, we have an invitation. The invitation is this: if you are not yet a Christian, if you have not yet obeyed Jesus Christ, then you are outside of the family. And we don't want that. We want you to be saved, to have your sins washed away, and to begin a new life with Him. It's not just what we want, it's what Jesus wants. He was the one who said, "Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." If you are ready to be baptized into Christ and have your sins washed away, there's water right here, and we provide opportunity for you to do that. Please come forward and let us know that you would like to make Jesus your Lord as we stand.